This is my true story. I raised my daughter with warmth, patience, and care here in a quiet town outside Savannah, Georgia. I thought growing old near family meant comfort, not cruelty. But one afternoon, the hand I once held so tenderly struck mine when I asked for something as simple as tea. That sound didn't just hurt my skin, it shattered years of faith. I didn't shout, I didn't argue. I simply decided the next move would be mine. What I did next changed everything. Before I tell you, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my story can reach more hearts like yours. I spent my whole life trying to make my daughter's world soft and full of light. From the day she was born, my hands were never still, building, fixing, earning, saving, just to keep a roof over her head and warm meals on our table. I remember holding her tiny fingers when she first learned to walk, steadying her steps so she wouldn't fall. Back then, she used to laugh and call me her hero. I made her favorite meals, told her bedtime stories until she fell asleep on my chest, and worked extra hours in the cold just to make sure she had the shoes she wanted for school. I thought that was what love looked like: quiet, patient, constant. When her mother passed away, I promised myself I'd be both parents for her. I never remarried. I didn't want her to feel second to anyone. I'd wake early before sunrise, drive through snow-covered streets of Ohio, and work long days at the auto shop just so she could have everything she asked for. Every paycheck I earned had her name written in my heart. I remember standing in line at the college office, paying her tuition, thinking my sacrifices were worth it. Every drop of sweat, every ache in my bones. I believed that love, once given, would come back naturally, that the child who once kissed my cheek before school would one day care for me with that same warmth. I never thought about what would happen when I grew old. I thought my love was enough to protect me. I thought she'd remember the nights I stayed up holding her when she had fevers, or the mornings I'd pack her lunch before she even woke up. I believed those memories would live in her heart the way they lived in mine. But love changes when people forget gratitude. The world teaches them that kindness is weakness. I never expected her to see me as a burden. I never thought my own daughter, the one who once said, "Daddy, you make everything better," would look at me like a problem to be solved. I didn't see it coming. You never do when your heart is full of love. You never imagine the day that same love becomes the reason you ache. That's the thing about being a father. You don't stop giving, even when no one remembers. I started noticing the change slowly, like a quiet winter creeping into a warm house. At first, it was little things. She stopped asking how I was feeling in the mornings. The phone calls that once came every evening became once a week, then once a month. I told myself she was busy. That's what people say when they don't want to face the truth. I thought her new life, her husband, her job in Atlanta, all of it just took more time than she had. But deep down, I knew something was shifting between us. Love was fading, replaced by something sharp and cold. When I moved in with her after my health started to slip, I believed it was temporary. My doctor in Chicago had said I needed rest and family support. I thought being around her would heal me faster. Instead, I began to feel like an unwanted guest in my own blood's home. The laughter that once filled her kitchen was gone. When I tried to help, folding laundry, watering plants, cleaning dishes, she'd sigh, roll her eyes, or whisper under her breath. Every act of kindness I offered was met with annoyance, as if my presence alone was an inconvenience. She no longer called me Dad. It became you. Just that single word, empty, distant, stripped of warmth. You're in the way. You don't need to do that. You should stay in your room. Each sentence built a wall between us, brick by brick. I'd sit by the window most days, watching cars pass by, wondering how a heart could turn so cold toward the person who once carried it through the world. At dinner, the table was full, but my chair felt isolated. Her husband barely spoke to me. Her children, my grandchildren, stared at their phones, barely lifting their heads. I was there, but invisible. A ghost, sitting in the home I helped pay for when she needed a down payment years ago. My mind often drifted to the old house back in Michigan, where her laughter used to echo down the hall as I made pancakes on Sunday mornings. I'd close my eyes and almost hear it again, until her sharp voice brought me back to the present. "You spilled again," she'd snap. "Be careful, you're always making a mess." It's strange how quickly love can turn into obligation. I felt it in every sigh, every look, every quiet dismissal. The warmth of family turned into the cold efficiency of caretaking, except there was no care left in it. I realized that what had once been love was now tolerance, and tolerance eventually becomes resentment. And when resentment takes over, respect dies quietly behind it. Still, I stayed silent. I told myself patience was a father's duty, that maybe, if I stayed gentle long enough, she'd remember who I was, not as a burden, but as the man who once gave her everything. But the more I gave her space, the smaller my space in her life became. And that's how it happens. Not in one big explosion, but in small moments. One forgotten thank you, one cold stare, one slammed door at a time. By the time I realized it, my daughter had already stopped seeing me as family. I was just an old man taking up space in her home. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind that feels heavy with stillness. Outside, the Georgia air hung warm and still, sunlight pouring through half-closed blinds that painted stripes of light across the kitchen floor. The house smelled faintly of brewed coffee and lemon soap, a familiar scent that should have felt comforting. But that day, the walls felt closer, the silence thicker. I sat by the table, my hands resting on the edge, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. My daughter moved around the kitchen with the kind of hurried impatience I'd come to recognize over the years. Every movement of hers sounded sharp, the slam of a cabinet, the clatter of a plate, the metallic scrape of a spoon on ceramic. I had been feeling a bit dizzy that day, the kind of weakness that comes with age. My doctor had said I needed to stay hydrated, keep my blood pressure steady. I waited for her to finish her chores before I asked. My voice came out softer than I intended, almost hesitant. "Could you pour me a cup of tea?" Though I didn't say those words aloud to you now, I just remember the sound of my own voice, frail but polite. She paused for a moment, her back to me, hands still over the sink. The silence that followed was heavier than the question itself. Then she exhaled, that deep sigh that always told me I'd already asked for too much. I watched her shoulders tighten. She didn't look at me. She reached for her phone instead, scrolling through something that seemed more important than the old man sitting in her kitchen. I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she'd get to it in a minute. But the longer I waited, the more that stillness started to sting. The kettle was right there, barely an arm's length away. Steam was still rising from the spout. She had just used it moments earlier for herself, so I decided to get up and do it myself. It was such a small thing, a cup of tea, but it felt like a step toward reclaiming a bit of dignity. My knees ached as I stood. Age turned small movements into quiet battles. I shuffled toward the counter, steadying myself on the table edge. She noticed me then, finally, but instead of concern, I saw irritation flash across her face. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Don't," she muttered. Though again, I only recall the sound, not the word. I reached for the handle of the kettle, careful not to spill, but my fingers trembled slightly from the weight. It was half full. The warmth from the metal bit into my palm. I was only trying to pour a little, just enough to make myself a small cup. The moment lasted less than a breath. She turned abruptly, crossing the room in a few sharp steps, and before I even realized it, her hand struck mine. The sound cracked through the quiet kitchen like a whip. My hand jerked back instinctively, the kettle slipping from my grasp and clanging against the counter. A few drops of hot water splashed against my wrist, not enough to burn, but enough to sting. I froze. My eyes stayed on the kettle, on the water pooling near the base, glinting under the light. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, her chest rising and falling, anger still trembling in her fingers. It wasn't the slap that hurt, not really. It was the disbelief, The shock that her hand, the same hand I'd once held while teaching her to cross the street, had struck me in that kitchen. Time stopped for a moment. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, every second a reminder that this was not a nightmare. This was my life now. An old man in his daughter's house, unwanted, unloved, and slapped for wanting tea. I slowly lowered myself back into the chair, my hand trembling over the table. The mark was faint, only red for a minute before fading. But inside, something deeper cracked. Not a bone, not a joint, but something invisible that had always held me together. I looked down at my hand, veins blue beneath wrinkled skin, and realized how fragile it looked. That same hand had once built her playhouse in our backyard in Michigan, painted her bedroom walls pink, and held her through every fever and heartbreak. Now it lay still, humiliated by the child it once protected. She turned away, muttering under her breath, busying herself with her phone again. Maybe she felt guilty. Maybe she didn't. I'll never know. I didn't say a word. My throat felt tight, my tongue heavy. Words would have only turned into arguments, and arguments are pointless when love is already dead. So I sat there quietly, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the same sound I'd been listening to when I first walked in. The tea was never poured. The moment passed, and the world went on as if nothing had happened. But something inside me shifted. That's the strange thing about pain. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, planting a seed deep inside you that says, "Enough." I spent the rest of that day in silence, pretending to nap while my thoughts ran wild. I thought about every moment I had bent over backwards for her, every bill I'd paid when her husband was out of work, every loan I'd forgiven, every babysitting weekend I'd spent so she could travel. I thought of how easily she had forgotten that love, and then I thought of my wife, her mother, and wondered if she could see what had become of the little girl she once tucked into bed with lullabies. The rain started that evening. It came soft at first, tapping against the window like a gentle rhythm. The house grew dim, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. I sat by the window for hours, watching droplets roll down the glass, each one catching the reflection of the warm lights outside. I wondered how many other old men across America were sitting by windows like mine, hearts heavy with disappointment from the very children they'd raised with love. Maybe somewhere in Kansas or up in Maine, another father was being spoken to like a burden. Maybe another man in California was being ignored at his own table. I wasn't alone. I knew that much. The night stretched long. My hand throbbed faintly, but my heart hurt more. I went to bed without dinner. The house was quiet except for the faint buzz of the TV from her room. I lay staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift across it as headlights passed outside. That's when I made a decision, not in anger, but in absolute clarity. I realized that love, when abused, must be protected from itself. I had given her everything, my years, my effort, my patience, and in return I had received contempt. I couldn't change her, but I could change what remained within my control. By morning, the redness on my hand had faded, but the memory stayed. When she entered the kitchen the next day, cheerful and chatty on the phone as if nothing had happened, I smiled politely. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger wastes energy that old men can't afford. I was simply done. Inside my chest, something steadied. I felt a strange calm, the kind you get before a storm when the air goes still. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I spent that afternoon at the lawyer's office, just a few blocks from downtown Savannah. The same office where years ago I had written her name into every clause of my will. I walked in with the same old briefcase, its leather cracked but sturdy, and sat across from the same man who'd helped me arrange my estate. His face softened when he saw me. We'd known each other for 20 years. I told him I wanted to make a few changes. He nodded without question. He'd seen that look before, the look of a parent who had finally stopped waiting for gratitude. It took hours to go through every detail. We reviewed my bank accounts, the property papers, and the shares in the small company I still partly owned from my working days. Each page felt like closing a door I'd left open too long. I rewrote my will that day, removing her name from every line. The words, "my daughter," appeared once more, but only to state that she would receive nothing further. Instead, I left everything to a small charity in Tampa that provided housing for veterans and seniors who had nowhere to go. I told the lawyer to make sure my will was sealed, stored safely, and updated immediately. As I signed my name, I felt no guilt, only peace. The pen glided across the paper, steady and sure. That single stroke was lighter than air, but heavier than years of suffering. It wasn't revenge, it was justice, quiet and simple. When I left the office, the sun was setting, and the air smelled of rain again. I walked slowly back home, each step lighter than the last. I realized that sometimes the loudest answer to cruelty is silence, followed by action. When I reached the house, my daughter was sitting in the living room, laughing on the phone. She didn't notice me walk past her. I went straight to my room, opened the small drawer by the bed, and placed the updated copy of my will inside. I looked at it one last time, then closed the drawer gently. I didn't need to say anything. Life would deliver the message when the time was right. That night, I brewed myself a cup of tea. My hands were still steady, though the skin showed its years. As the steam rose, I thought about how strange it was. The same hands she had slapped now held the power to shape her future. I sat by the window again, sipping slowly, watching the rain ease off into a mist. The world outside felt calm, almost forgiving. Inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. And that's when I understood something important. A father's silence isn't weakness. It's a warning. Because one day, that silence turns into decisions that no one can undo. That night felt longer than most. The kind of night that stretches thin and quiet, where even the sound of your own breathing feels too loud. Outside my window in Savannah, the streets were slick with rain. Streetlights glowed against puddles, painting golden circles that rippled whenever a car passed. I sat by the small wooden table near my bed, my cup of tea cooling slowly beside me. The house was silent. My daughter had already gone to her room. Her laughter from the phone call had faded into distant hums behind the door. For the first time, I didn't feel like I lived there. I felt like a guest in someone else's home. The quiet can be cruel. It reminds you of everything you've lost, everything you've tolerated, and everything you've chosen not to say. I stared at my hands for a long while, the same hands that had built a family, paid for schools, fixed broken fences, and wiped tears. They looked worn, veins raised like faint roads leading nowhere. The redness from the slap had faded, but the memory was still fresh. It sat there between my fingers like a scar that couldn't be seen, only felt. I thought about how strange life becomes with age. When you're young, you imagine family as a circle that will always stay intact. Laughter around dinner tables, shared meals on holidays, phone calls just to say, "I love you." But somewhere between growing up and growing old, that circle breaks. You stop being the center of your children's world and start becoming part of their routine. At first, it feels natural, a shift, a passing of time. But then one day, you wake up and realize you've become invisible in your own story. That night, I remembered the house in Ohio, where she'd taken her first steps. It was a small white house with a creaky porch and blue shutters that needed repainting every spring. I could still picture her running through the yard in pigtails, chasing butterflies with her mother's laughter echoing in the background. She'd fall sometimes, scrape her knees, and run to me crying. I'd lift her up, clean her wounds, and tell her she was brave. Back then, her tiny hands used to cling to mine, as if I was the only safe place in the world. Those same hands now belong to a woman who couldn't bear to pour me a cup of tea. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly. The smell of the rain outside mixed with the faint scent of lavender from my late wife's old pillow that I kept on the chair. Grief is a strange companion. It never truly leaves you. It just waits quietly in corners until nights like this. And that night, it sat beside me, whispering questions I didn't want to answer. Where did I go wrong? How does love turn to resentment? How does a child forget the softness that raised them? Somewhere around midnight, thunder rolled in the distance, The rain began again, steady and slow. Drops hit the window pane like a rhythm only the lonely can hear. I sipped my tea, now lukewarm, and stared at the street outside. An elderly couple walked past under an umbrella, holding hands, moving slowly, but together. I wondered if they had children too. Did their children visit them? Did they call every Sunday? Did they say thank you? Or did they too have stories like mine? Stories they never told out loud because people don't like to hear about old age unless it's sweet and tidy. Age is not just a number. It's a mirror. It reflects everything you gave, everything you endured, and how people remember it. For me, that mirror had cracked. My daughter didn't see her father anymore. She saw an obligation. I had become something to manage, not someone to love, and that realization, more than the slap, was what made my chest ache that night. I didn't sleep for hours. I sat in the same spot, letting memories roll through me like waves. Some gentle, some sharp. I remembered the time she graduated from college in North Carolina, the way she had hugged me, eyes shining, whispering that she'd make me proud. I remembered walking her down the aisle in a small church outside Atlanta, holding her hand as her mother cried. I remembered helping her buy her first home, signing papers while she smiled. Every milestone of her life had my fingerprints on it. And yet, years later, when I reached for a kettle, her first instinct was to strike the same hand that had fed her. Pain has a way of sharpening your memory. Every moment that night felt vivid. The taste of the tea, the chill in the air, the faint hum of the air conditioner. I wasn't angry. That's the part people never understand. Old men don't get angry easily. They get quiet. They go still. They begin to plan. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. But peace requires boundaries, and I had allowed mine to be erased for too long. I looked at the small photo on my bedside, my wife holding our newborn daughter. The picture was faded, the colors soft and washed out. My wife's smile was kind, tired, full of the sort of love that made everything seem possible. I whispered to her in my thoughts, telling her what had happened that day, telling her how I'd finally decided to stop waiting for respect that would never come. Somewhere deep down, I imagined she would have agreed. She was the strong one, the kind of woman who knew when kindness needed to end. The clock ticked past 2 a.m. The house was dark, except for the soft light from the lamp beside me. I could hear the rain still falling, gentle now, like an apology from the sky. I got up slowly, my knees protesting, and walked toward the window. Outside, everything looked calm. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, feeling the faint vibration of thunder far away. That's when it hit me, the irony of it all. My daughter thought I was powerless because I was old. She thought age meant weakness. But she didn't understand that years teach more than they take away. I had seen enough of life to know that patience, when used correctly, can be more powerful than anger. I decided right then that I would reclaim my life, not by shouting, not by fighting, but by choosing silence that spoke louder than her words ever could. I would protect what little remained of my peace, even if that meant protecting it from her. Around 3, I finally lay down. The sheets were cold, but I didn't mind. My mind felt lighter, clearer. I watched the ceiling again, tracing the faint cracks with my eyes. I thought about my lawyer, about the new will sitting safely in his office downtown, about the signature that had already rewritten the future. I had taken back control without lifting my voice, and that thought comforted me in a way nothing else could. As I drifted toward sleep, a memory came back to me, a simple one. Years ago, when she was 10, she had accidentally broken my favorite mug. She'd cried for hours, thinking I'd be angry. I had told her, things can be replaced. People can't. Now, lying in that dark room, I realized the opposite was also true. Some people can be replaced by peace, by distance, by self-respect. When morning came, I woke to the sound of birds outside. The rain had stopped, and sunlight crept across the blinds. My daughter was already gone, off to work. The kitchen was quiet again. The kettle sat in the same place on the counter, as if waiting for me. I walked over, filled it, and made myself a fresh cup of tea. My hand didn't shake this time. I watched the steam rise, curling into the air like a ghost, disappearing into the morning light. I took my cup to the porch and sat in the old wicker chair. The wood creaked beneath me, but it held steady. The air smelled fresh, clean after the rain. For the first time in months, I didn't feel trapped. I felt free. I looked out at the street, where the mail trucks stopped at every house. Neighbors waved from across the yard, polite smiles of people who didn't know what kind of story was unfolding behind my front door. I smiled back. Some stories don't need an audience. They just need an ending. As I sipped the tea, I thought about how small actions can carry enormous meaning. A slap can change a life. A pen stroke can change a future. And sometimes, silence, real silence, can rebuild a soul. I had learned that lesson not from books, but from pain. The tea was warm, soothing. I looked down at my reflection in the cup, old, lined, but steady. I realized that even after all that had happened, I still loved my daughter. Love doesn't vanish, it just changes shape. Mine had turned from a giving kind to a distant one, the kind that prays for someone's peace without needing to be part of it. That morning, I prayed she would one day understand, that she would realize what she lost, not in money or inheritance, but in the quiet respect of the man who had once been her home. By the time the clock struck 8, the world outside was awake. Cars on the street, dogs barking, the sound of life moving forward. I sat there for another hour, just breathing, just existing. It was the simplest kind of peace, earned, not given. That night changed me forever, not because of the slap, but because it reminded me that even love needs limits, that dignity, once surrendered, must be reclaimed with care, and that sometimes the people you raise teach you what not to tolerate in the end. The next morning, the air in Savannah felt heavy with humidity, that familiar southern kind that clings to your skin even before sunrise. I woke early, before the birds, before the world started moving again. My bones ached the way they always do after a restless night, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. It's funny how pain can clear your thoughts better than sleep ever could. I sat at the edge of my bed, hands folded over my knees, staring at the small drawer where my will sat quietly. The same drawer where my daughter had once kept her school projects when she was young. Back then, it held glitter and crayons. Now, it held consequences. I made up my mind before the sun fully rose. I wasn't going to live in a house built on disrespect. I had spent too many years tolerating silence that screamed louder than words, and that slap had been the full stop to a sentence I'd been reading for far too long. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger fades. It burns itself out. What I felt instead was something colder, something clearer. Resolve. I washed my face, looked into the mirror above the sink, and barely recognized the man staring back. Wrinkles, yes, but behind them, a steadiness that had been missing. The eyes looking back at me didn't belong to a victim. They belonged to someone who was about to reclaim the story. I buttoned up a clean shirt, one I hadn't worn in months, and made myself a small breakfast. Toast, 2 eggs, black coffee. Simple things. The kind of meal that grounds you before you change your life. Outside, the early light made everything look softer than it really was. The oak trees that lined the street swayed gently, and the smell of wet soil lingered from the night's rain. My neighbor, Mrs. Taylor, waved from her porch as she watered her flowers. She always asked how I was doing, always offered a kind smile, though she never knew the full story. "Morning," I said, pretending everything was fine. It was a lie, but a harmless one. I didn't need sympathy. I needed action. I drove downtown in my old Ford, the same truck I'd kept since the 90s. It rattled a bit, but still carried me where I needed to go. The drive took about 20 minutes, passing familiar landmarks. The diner where I used to take my wife for Sunday breakfast. The small park where my daughter had once learned to ride her bike. Each site carried a memory, and each memory reminded me how much love I had invested in people who no longer valued it, When I reached my lawyer's office, the streets were still quiet. The building was old brick with white shutters, sitting on a corner near Forsyth Park. I'd been there many times before for small matters, taxes, property papers, advice. But that day felt different. I wasn't there as a client in need. I was there as a man ready to protect himself. The receptionist recognized me and smiled politely. "Morning, Mr. Harris," she said. "He's expecting you." My lawyer, Robert Sinclair, had known me for over 20 years. A tall man with graying hair and an old-fashioned sense of right and wrong. He'd helped me when my wife passed, when I bought the second property, and when I first wrote my will years ago. He looked up from his desk as I walked in, concern already visible in his eyes. "You look tired," he said gently. "Is everything all right?" I nodded, though inside, nothing was all right. I sat down across from him, took a deep breath, and said the only words that mattered that day. "I want to change everything." He leaned back in his chair, quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Everything?" he asked. I nodded again. He didn't pry. Good lawyers never do. He simply opened a file drawer, pulled out the old copy of my will, and placed it on the desk. The weight of it felt heavier than paper should feel. Years of love, trust, and assumptions bound together in neat legal language. I stared at my own handwriting from years ago, next to her name, and felt the sting of how naive I had been. Robert adjusted his glasses and waited. "Tell me what you want done," he said. I told him everything. Every detail. I explained that I wanted her name removed from the will entirely. No inheritance, no property, no bank access. Everything I owned would go elsewhere. Some to charity, some to the community center I used to volunteer at, and the rest to a small scholarship fund I wanted established in my wife's name. I wanted something good to come from the wreckage, something that would outlive bitterness. Robert took notes quietly, the sound of his pen scratching across paper steady and calm. When I finished, he looked at me for a long moment. "You're sure?" he asked softly. "These are permanent changes." I smiled faintly. "So was the moment she stopped being my daughter," I said. He didn't ask more. He simply went to work. For the next 2 hours, I sat in that office as he typed, printed, and reviewed every clause. I watched him write the new names, the scholarship, the donation, the trust, all replacing hers. Each line felt like closing a door gently but firmly. It wasn't cruelty, it was closure. When the final version was printed, he slid it across the table. "All set," he said. "You just need to sign here and here." I took the pen and held it steady. My hand didn't tremble this time. The first signature felt like forgiveness. The second felt like freedom. By the time I put the pen down, it was done. Years of quiet suffering had been reduced to ink on paper, clean, final, legal. Robert looked at me as if searching for sadness, but there was none left to find. "Do you want to keep a copy?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, you keep it. Make sure it's filed immediately." He nodded, then leaned back, hands folded. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "You're protecting your peace." I thanked him and stood. The air outside felt lighter, even though the day had grown hotter. The streets were busier now, tourists walking toward the park, children eating ice cream, couples holding hands. I moved among them like a ghost, invisible but free. I stopped by a small coffee shop near the corner, ordered a cup, and sat by the window. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the need to check my phone, didn't care who called or didn't call. I just sat there, watching life go on. Across the street, I saw a young man helping his mother into a car, his hand steady under her elbow. They laughed about something, the kind of laughter that carries warmth instead of mockery. For a second, I felt a twinge of sadness, not jealousy, just nostalgia. That could have been us once. But then I reminded myself, I had done my part. You can't force people to stay kind. You can only make sure they don't have power over you when they stop being kind. On my way home, I stopped at the florist. The woman behind the counter knew me well. I often bought small bouquets for my wife's grave at Bonaventure Cemetery. The usual? She asked. I nodded. White lilies this time. They were her favorites. She wrapped them neatly, tied with a ribbon. I drove to the cemetery, parked under the shade of an old oak, and made my way down the gravel path. The air smelled of rain and flowers, and the ground was soft beneath my shoes. Her headstone was simple, just her name, dates, and a small inscription we'd chosen together long ago. Where love stays, peace follows. I knelt down slowly, placing the lilies by the stone, brushing away a few fallen leaves. I did what needed to be done, I whispered softly. She forgot who we raised her to be. But I remembered who you wanted me to stay. The breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby river. I sat there for a long while, talking to her in my head. About the house, the slap, the lawyer, the tea. I told her how I'd stopped waiting for kindness that would never return, and for the first time in years, I felt as if she was proud of me again. By the time I left, the sun was beginning to set, streaks of gold cutting through the Spanish moss that hung from the trees. I drove home slowly, windows down, air warm against my face. I didn't dread walking through the door anymore. I wasn't living in that house as a defeated man. I was living there as someone who had reclaimed his dignity. When I got back, the lights were off. My daughter hadn't returned from work yet. I went straight to my room, sat down, and pulled out an old leather journal from the drawer. I hadn't written in it for years, not since my wife passed. But that night, I opened to a blank page and began to write. Not about her cruelty, but about my peace. About how sometimes protecting yourself means disappointing others. About how strength isn't about shouting. It's about knowing when to stop talking. I wrote until my hand cramped, the ink smudging slightly where my fingers trembled with age. When I finished, I closed the book and placed it beside the lamp. My heart felt lighter. The decision had been made, the paper signed, the path chosen. Nothing left to fear now. Before bed, I brewed myself another cup of tea. This time, it tasted different, maybe because it was made with freedom instead of expectation. I sipped slowly, staring out the window as crickets chirped in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, but it sounded softer now, almost like approval. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no worries, no noise. Just rest. The kind that comes when a man finally stops waiting for someone else to value him. And when morning came, I knew I had done the right thing. The morning sun poured through the blinds, thin golden lines cutting across the floor of my small living room. I sat there in the quiet, the same quiet that used to feel lonely, but now felt like strength. On the table lay the folder from Robert's office, my newly signed will, fresh with ink that still smelled faintly of paper and permanence. I didn't open it right away. I just looked at it for a while, as if it were some kind of living proof that my story had finally changed direction. It's strange how a single document can hold an entire life between its pages. For years, that paper had represented love, hope, and trust. Now it represented something different: balance, justice. The truth written plainly, not out of anger, but out of necessity. When I'd first written my will years ago, I'd filled it with warmth, imagining my daughter would read it one day and feel gratitude. I'd written messages about family, legacy, and the love that built it all. But that morning, as I opened the folder and scanned the clean new version, I felt no warmth, no sentimentality, just peace. Her name wasn't there anymore, not even once. The lines that once promised her a house, a bank account, and land in Georgia were now replaced with new ones, names of people who had earned respect instead of assuming it. I'd added the nurse from St. Mary's Clinic who had checked on me every month since my wife's passing, the friend who still called to ask how I was doing, and the community center that offered free meals to veterans. They were the ones who had shown kindness without asking for anything in return. They were the ones who deserved to see something come back their way. I ran my fingers over the signatures at the bottom. My name, steady and deliberate. The witness signatures, firm and clear. Robert's notary stamp pressed deep into the paper. Every mark told a story. Every mark meant finality, and it struck me then how poetic it was. My daughter's slap had started it all, but this pen stroke was the real ending. After breakfast, I decided to take a drive. The air was crisp that morning, with just a hint of salt drifting in from the coast. Savannah has that way about it. Warm one day, quiet and windy the next, like the city itself is always deep in thought. I drove slowly through the oak-lined streets, the Spanish moss hanging like tired curtains above. The world seemed softer somehow. I parked by the small cafe downtown, the one near the old post office, where the floor still creaked when you walked. The waitress there, a kind woman named Lucy, knew my order before I even said it. "Black coffee and a slice of pecan pie?" she asked with a smile. I nodded. I'd been coming there for years, always sitting in the same corner by the window. From there, I could watch people pass. Tourists with cameras, kids with backpacks, couples holding hands. As I stirred my coffee, I thought about how easy it is for life to turn. You spend decades building something, and then one day, one choice changes everything. But sometimes, that change isn't a collapse. It's a correction. My daughter had taken my patience for weakness. She had mistaken silence for surrender. What she didn't realize was that silence can also mean strategy. When I was younger, working long hours in construction outside Charleston, I learned that lesson early. My boss at the time, a stern man named Patrick, once told me, "Never react with heat when you can respond with plans." At the time, I didn't understand it. I was too hot-headed, too eager to defend myself. But as the years went by, those words settled somewhere deep inside me. That's what I'd done now. Replaced reaction with response. I spent a few hours in that cafe, watching the world go by. Nobody there knew that inside my briefcase sat a document that rewrote my family's future. Nobody knew that a man sitting quietly by a window had just changed the course of his life without raising his voice. And there was something powerful about that anonymity, the kind that comes when you realize peace doesn't need to be announced. It just needs to be lived. Later that afternoon, I drove to the bank. It was a tall glass building on the edge of the city, one of those modern places that felt too clean, too cold. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and paper. I met with the financial officer, a young man named Thomas, polite and efficient. He reviewed the documents Robert had already sent over, nodding as he clicked through his computer. "Everything looks good, Mr. Harris," he said. "The trust updates have been processed, and all linked accounts have been changed according to your new instructions." Hearing those words felt like an invisible weight lifting from my chest. My daughter no longer had access to any of it. No accounts, no property ties, no way to undo what I'd done. I thanked Thomas and left quietly, the automatic doors closing behind me with a soft hiss. Driving home, I passed the little park by the river, the same park where I used to bring my daughter when she was 6. She'd chase ducks near the pond while I sat on a bench reading the newspaper. Sometimes she'd bring me wildflowers, dandelions, clovers, whatever she could find, and say, "These are for you, Daddy." I remembered the way her eyes used to shine when she said it. Back then, her love had been pure, unfiltered. Time had changed that. But as I drove by, I realized something important. My love hadn't vanished. It had simply been redirected. Not toward her, but toward myself, toward peace, toward the version of me that deserved better. When I got home, the house was quiet again. The clock ticked steadily, a sound that had once made me feel lonely, but now felt comforting. I took off my jacket, sat down at the table, and opened my briefcase once more. The folder was there, the fresh ink now dry. I took out the copy Robert had given me and read it again from beginning to end. Line after line confirmed what I already knew. I was free. No more pretending, no more hoping for change that would never come. My estate, my decisions, my story, all finally mine again. I reached the last page, where my signature sat neatly at the bottom, and smiled. It looked firm, strong, not the shaky writing of an old man, but the mark of someone who'd reclaimed his authority. I placed the will back into the folder and slid it into the drawer. On top of it, I placed a single sheet of paper I had written the night before. A note for my lawyer to be read only when the time came. It wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was simply honest. I'd written, "To those who loved me with respect, may this gift bring comfort. To those who forgot what love means, may the silence remind them." The rest of the evening passed quietly. I made dinner, baked salmon, steamed vegetables, and a small glass of red wine. The kind of meal that makes you feel human again. I ate slowly, listening to the sound of cicadas outside, their hum steady and endless. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's wind chimes sang softly in the night breeze. After dinner, I sat on the porch, watching the sky fade from orange to purple. I thought about how fragile relationships can be, how easily they can break when pride replaces gratitude. My daughter thought she'd taught me a lesson that day in the kitchen when she slapped my hand. But in truth, she had freed me from illusion. I'd always believed family meant unconditional love, but love without respect is a cage. That night, I realized I'd finally stepped outside of it. As darkness fell, I felt no regret, just calm. The decision was done, the ink was dry, and the past no longer had power over me. The future, whatever was left of it, was mine to live quietly. Before heading to bed, I made myself another cup of tea. It had become a ritual now, my small symbol of independence. The kettle hissed softly, the scent of Earl Grey filling the room. I poured it carefully, feeling the warmth spread through my hands. I sat by the window again, sipping slowly, the same way I had the night of the slap. Only this time, there was no sadness, only clarity. I looked out at the stars scattered over the Savannah sky, and for the first time in years, I whispered a thank you, not to anyone else, but to myself, for surviving, for choosing dignity, for having the strength to rewrite my story, even when it meant letting go of the person I loved most. When I finally went to bed, the air outside was still. The cicadas had quieted, and the city was asleep. I pulled the blanket over me and closed my eyes. There were no tears, no bitterness, no anger. Just peace. The kind that comes when you know you've done what's right, not for revenge, but for your own soul. That night, as I drifted into sleep, I thought about ink. How something so small, so simple, could carry so much weight. A single stroke of a pen had done what years of conversation couldn't. It had restored balance. And as I lay there, I realized that sometimes the most powerful things we do in life aren't loud or dramatic. They're quiet, deliberate, and permanent, like ink drying on a page that no one can rewrite. The day of the reveal came slower than I expected, though I'd known it was coming. Weeks had passed since I'd changed the will, and life had found a strange rhythm again. Quiet mornings, small meals, a sense of peace that didn't rely on anyone's approval. I'd begun spending more time in the garden out back, trimming the hedges and watering the azaleas. The air in Savannah had shifted to that soft autumn coolness, the kind that smells faintly of pine and river mist. The world had calmed, but inside, I knew a storm was waiting for its cue. It started one Sunday afternoon. I was sitting on the porch, reading an old newspaper, when I saw her car pull into the driveway, a shiny black SUV she'd bought last year. I could tell by the way she parked, crooked, fast, impatient, that something had changed. When she got out, her steps were quick but hesitant, like someone who didn't want to admit why they were there. I didn't move. I didn't even close the paper. I just waited. She walked up the steps, her eyes puffy, her face pale. "Dad," she began, voice trembling, "I heard you've been not well." There it was, the performance I had been expecting. Concern wrapped in guilt, words rehearsed in the car mirror before knocking on my door. I simply nodded and gestured toward the chair across from me. She sat down, fidgeting with her purse strap. The air between us was thick with unspoken things, the slap, the silence, the distance. I watched her carefully, noticing how she couldn't hold my gaze for more than a few seconds. Time has a way of turning confidence into shame when truth catches up. After a while, she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded letter. "I found something," she said. "From your lawyer." My heart stayed steady. Robert had warned me she might try to fish for information. I had left one envelope intentionally where she might find it, a decoy. She handed it to me with shaking hands. I opened it slowly. It was an official notice from Robert's office confirming that the will had been updated and filed. That was it. No details, no names, just confirmation that something had changed. I looked at her, calm as still water. Her eyes searched my face for clues, desperation seeping through her voice. "Dad, you changed it, didn't you?" she whispered. "You changed everything." I didn't answer. Silence can sometimes do more damage than any speech. I folded the paper neatly and placed it on the table beside me. She leaned forward, her voice cracking. "Why would you do that? After everything? Everything." That word hung in the air like smoke. Everything to her meant every dollar, every piece of property, every advantage she thought would be waiting when I was gone. Not the bedtime stories, not the school fees, not the roof over her head during every storm. Her definition of everything was made of things, not love. I finally spoke, my voice low and even. Because love without respect doesn't belong in ink. She froze. Tears welled in her eyes, not because she understood, but because she realized what she had lost. For years, she had treated me like a placeholder, someone to depend on until my usefulness ran out. Now, the world had turned upside down for her, and she couldn't find her footing. She tried again, her voice breaking this time. "Dad, please, I made a mistake. I didn't mean..." But I raised my hand gently, not in anger, just to stop the noise. I told her I didn't need apologies shaped by fear of loss. I needed honesty, the kind that couldn't be performed. She lowered her head, the tears falling quietly onto her lap. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel pity. I felt distance, not cruel distance, but the kind that comes when a heart has finally stopped bleeding. After a long silence, I got up and went inside. She followed, her steps softer now, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. I walked to my study, opened the drawer, and took out the envelope Robert had prepared for this very moment, the real one this time. I turned and handed it to her. "This," I said, "is the truth you wanted." She hesitated before taking it. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet, the new will's cover letter listing the beneficiaries. Her name was not among them. Her breath caught. She read it once, twice, 3 times, as if hoping her eyes were lying. When she finally looked up, her face was pale, lips trembling. "You can't do this," she whispered. "I already did," I said. The tears came then, fast and hard. She sank into the nearest chair, crying the way she hadn't since she was a child. I didn't move to comfort her. That urge, that instinct every parent feels to shield their child, had finally gone quiet. Not from cruelty, but from exhaustion. I had spent a lifetime fixing her mistakes, forgiving her temper, and overlooking her pride. But this moment, wasn't about fixing anything. It was about letting consequences breathe. Between sobs, she asked, "Where does it all go then?" I told her the truth, about the nurse, the community center, the scholarship fund in her mother's name. I told her how every cent would serve someone who gave kindness instead of taking it. She listened in silence, eyes red, face streaked with tears. When I finished, she looked away, whispering something under her breath that I couldn't hear. For a moment, I almost reached out. Habit is a powerful thing. But then I stopped myself. She had to live through this silence. She had to feel the emptiness that greed creates. That was the only way she'd ever understand what she had broken. After a while, she stood. Her posture was stiff, her face set in the expression of someone who wanted to argue but couldn't find the strength. She wiped her tears, grabbed her purse, and said softly, "You've changed." I smiled faintly. "No," I said. I finally stopped pretending. She left without another word. The sound of her car door closing echoed across the yard like a final punctuation mark. I sat down again, staring at the space she'd just left, the air still heavy with the ghost of her perfume. For the first time in years, I felt something close to freedom. That evening, I called Robert. He answered on the second ring. "It's done," I told him. "She knows." There was a pause, then his calm, measured voice replied, "How do you feel?" "Lighter," I said, and I meant it. After hanging up, I went for a walk down to the river. The air was cool, the sunset soft and golden over the Savannah skyline. The water reflected everything, the bridges, the trees, the fading light. I stood there for a while, hands in my pockets, listening to the hum of the city in the distance. People laughed, dogs barked, boats passed, life moving on, indifferent but beautiful. It struck me how much of life is about letting go of illusions. I had spent years holding on to the illusion that family would always mean love, that if you gave enough, forgave enough, endured enough, eventually it would come back to you. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the people you raise grow into strangers, and the only thing you can do is stop letting them hurt you. As I walked back home, the streetlights flickered on one by one. The houses glowed softly behind curtains, the smell of dinner drifting through open windows. Ordinary life continued all around me, and I realized, that's the point. Pain doesn't stop the world. It only stops you if you let it. When I got home, the house felt peaceful again. I brewed a small cup of tea, sat on the porch, and looked out at the stars beginning to appear. Somewhere, she was probably sitting in her house, staring at that letter, realizing that for the first time in her life, she couldn't undo what I'd done. I didn't hate her. I didn't even want her to suffer. I just wanted her to understand that love has limits, and when those limits are crossed, silence becomes the only answer left. I sat there long into the night, listening to the crickets and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. My heart was steady, my breathing calm. I thought of my wife again, how she'd have handled it all. She would have smiled that small, knowing smile and said, "Sometimes you have to lose something to remind others what they had." She would have been right. That night, before I went to bed, I took the decoy letter, the one my daughter had found first, and tore it into small pieces. I dropped them into the trash and watched them fall, one by one. Paper lies easily. Ink, though. Ink tells the truth, and mine had already dried. The morning after she left, the house was still, the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm has spent all its rage. I sat in my chair by the window, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm, watching the rain tap gently against the glass. Savannah rain has a rhythm, not angry, not sharp, but soft and steady, like a tired heart beating through old grief. It felt fitting. The world outside was washing itself clean, and in a way, so was I. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up waiting for her footsteps, her voice, or her moods. The silence that once felt cruel now felt earned. I'd spent decades fearing loneliness, thinking it would be unbearable to live without family nearby. But that morning, as the rain whispered against the window pane, I realized something I should have known long ago. Peace isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of cruelty. Word began to spread faster than I expected. Small towns and old neighborhoods carry stories the way wind carries pollen, quietly but thoroughly. Within a few days, I began to notice subtle changes. The neighbors who once looked at me with pity now nodded with quiet respect. Mrs. Taylor from across the street brought me homemade biscuits again, something she hadn't done in years since my daughter had told her to stop treating him like a charity case. People started to understand. They always do, eventually. A week later, I went to the market down by the river, the one I'd been going to since the 1970s. The owner, old Mr. Lewis, called out from behind the counter. "Heard you finally stood up for yourself, George," he said, a proud grin spreading across his face. "About damn time." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt good to be seen not as fragile, but as firm. When I got home that afternoon, I found an envelope pushed under the door. Her handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Neat, slightly slanted, the way she used to write birthday cards when she was young. I hesitated before opening it. Part of me hoped for something real, something human. But when I unfolded the paper, the words were exactly what I expected. It wasn't an apology. It was negotiation. She wrote about family misunderstandings, about how she was ready to talk things over. But the last line gave her away completely. "I just want to make sure the will is fair, Dad." Fair, that word again, the one people use when what they mean is profitable. I folded the letter slowly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer where all her other empty gestures lived. Untouched birthday cards, half-hearted notes, promises she never meant to keep. I didn't even bother replying. Some silences speak louder than any sentence. Over the next few weeks, the ripples grew larger. Her friends began to distance themselves. The same people she used to boast to about taking care of her old man were now whispering behind her back. Word had spread that she'd been written out, not because of money, but because of shame. One evening, my neighbor's son, a kind man in his 40s, stopped by with his little boy. They brought over a box of donuts and stayed for tea. "You know," he said quietly, "my wife told me what happened. She said your daughter's been having a hard time with people talking." I nodded, sipping my tea. "Let them talk," I said. "Truth travels slower, but it lasts longer." He smiled, then looked at his son. "My boy's been asking why family matters so much," he said. "I think I'll tell him your story one day." That night, after they left, I sat by the fire and thought about that. How sometimes your pain becomes someone else's lesson. It's a strange kind of legacy, but it's still a form of teaching. Around the third week, I received a call from Robert. He told me the final documents had been processed through the courts, all public, all official. The scholarship fund was approved under my wife's name, the Margaret Harris Scholarship for Nursing Students. I felt my throat tighten, hearing her name said out loud like that again. It had been too long since her kindness had touched anything in this world, and now, through those papers, it would touch lives again. I drove to the community center that weekend, the same one where I used to volunteer when I was younger. The new director, a cheerful woman named Denise, welcomed me with open arms. "We'll make sure your wife's name lives on here," she said warmly. "Every student we help will know who she was." I smiled and nodded. "That's all I ever wanted," I said. Walking out of that building, I felt lighter than I had in years. It struck me that my daughter's cruelty had, in a strange way, resurrected my wife's goodness. The slap that tried to humiliate me had instead created a legacy of compassion. Life has a way of balancing things when we stop interfering. But balance isn't always kind. While I was rebuilding my peace, she was unraveling. I heard through a mutual friend that she'd been calling around, trying to find ways to contest the will. Robert had already warned me she might try, but the documents were airtight, every clause precise. I had taken my time with them. You learn patience after 70 years, and I'd learned it well. The law was on my side, and her desperation had no legal ground to stand on. The last I heard, she had sold her car and moved out of her big suburban home, the same house I had helped her pay the down payment for when she first got married. I didn't feel anger, just a quiet sort of ache, not for her loss, but for how easily she'd traded love for pride. Months went by. Seasons changed. Savannah turned colder, and the holidays crept in. The first Christmas I'd spent entirely alone. But even that didn't hurt the way I thought it would. I put up a small tree by the window, hung 2 ornaments, one for me, one for my wife, and watched the city lights flicker through the glass. It was peaceful, in its own quiet way. On Christmas Eve, I received a letter. Not from her this time, but from the community center. Inside was a photo of 3 young nursing students holding their certificates, the first recipients of the scholarship in my wife's name. They were smiling, proud, their hands clutching the papers that bore my wife's legacy. Beneath the photo was a short note. "Your gift has already changed 3 lives." I sat there for a long time, staring at the photo, tears welling in my eyes. For the first time in a long time, I cried, not from sadness, but from gratitude. I whispered her name under my breath, feeling her presence in that moment. Margaret would have been proud. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small shifts in myself. I walked lighter. I smiled more easily. I even started chatting with people at the market again. The old man everyone once pitied had become someone new, someone they looked at and said, "He's still got something left in him." Every so often, though, I'd think of my daughter. I wondered if she ever thought of me, or if her pride still stood like a wall between us. I didn't wish her pain. I only wished her understanding. But I'd learned the hard way that some lessons can't be taught with words. They have to be lived, slowly, painfully, until the truth sinks in. And in time, I knew it would. One evening, I walked down to the pier near the Savannah River. The air was cool, the sky painted in hues of pink and amber. I watched the boats drift lazily across the water, their reflections rippling in the golden light. It reminded me of life, constantly moving, even when you think it's still. I took out my phone, scrolled through old photos, and stopped at one, her as a child, standing in front of the Christmas tree, wearing her mother's red scarf. She couldn't have been more than 7. The smile on her face was pure, unspoiled. I stared at it for a long time. That little girl didn't know who she'd become, and the man looking at her had finally stopped trying to save her. I closed the photo and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Then I looked up at the horizon and whispered softly, "It's all right now." Because it was. That night, back home, I wrote in my journal again, the one I'd started after changing the will. I wrote about peace, about letting go, about how dignity doesn't mean revenge. It means knowing when to end a chapter without tearing out the pages. And I ended with one line, the same one I hope someone finds someday when I'm gone. She cried when I poured my will away, but I didn't do it to hurt her. I did it so she could finally see what love without gratitude looks like. Nothing. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, in small moments that most people wouldn't even notice. It came with the first morning I woke up and realized I didn't have to brace myself for sharp words or cold glances. It came in the hum of the kettle, the whistle of the wind through the trees behind my house, the way sunlight crept across the porch as if it was checking in on me. Life had slowed down, but it hadn't stopped. And for the first time in a long while, I was thankful for that. I sold the old house, the one that had held both laughter and pain, and bought a modest place just outside Savannah, near Tybee Island. It wasn't much, but it had what I needed. A porch with a rocking chair, a small kitchen, and a patch of garden big enough for tomatoes and sunflowers. I remember the day I moved in. The air smelled like salt and soil, and the seagulls cried overhead. I stood in the doorway with the keys in my hand and thought, this is what freedom feels like. Quiet, clean, and mine. The neighbors were kind. Mrs. Dalton from next door baked pies every Sunday and left one by my gate with a little note. Across the street lived a retired Navy man named Frank, who'd wave every morning while walking his dog. It was a small community, simple but warm, the kind that still looked out for each other. Nobody asked me about my family. Nobody pried. They just treated me like a man who deserved respect, and that alone felt like healing. Each morning, I'd wake early, brew a pot of coffee, and sit on the porch to watch the sunrise over the marsh. The light came slow and golden, stretching across the tall grass until it reached the water. Some mornings, I'd see pelicans diving or fishermen casting their nets in the distance. The rhythm of it all reminded me that the world kept turning, even when people didn't. I filled my days with small routines, gardening, reading, cooking simple meals. I started walking to the farmer's market on Saturdays, talking to folks who sold honey and fresh bread. I found peace in the ordinariness of it all. Nobody cared about wills, money, or what I'd done to my daughter. They just saw an old man buying vegetables, smiling at strangers, and carrying his own bags. That's how I wanted to be remembered, not as the man who taught his daughter a lesson, but as the man who learned his own. Every Sunday, I'd drive into the city for church, not because I was particularly religious, but because sitting in the back pew, listening to the choir, gave me something that money or apologies never could. Stillness. The pastor, a kind woman with a soft voice, often spoke about forgiveness. At first, I avoided that word. Forgiveness had always felt too heavy, too complicated. But over time, I realized it wasn't about excusing what happened. It was about releasing the weight of it from your own chest. One afternoon after service, I stayed behind as people trickled out. The pastor noticed me sitting there and walked over. "You seem lighter these days," she said kindly. I nodded. "I guess I stopped expecting apologies from people who aren't ready to give them." She smiled, placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, and said, "That's how peace begins." And she was right. I didn't hear from my daughter for months after the letter incident. The silence was its own kind of message. At first, I wondered if she was angry, ashamed, or maybe both. But in time, I realized it didn't matter. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to remind you which rivers not to cross again. One day, as I was pruning the rose bushes out back, my phone rang. The screen flashed her name. My heart didn't race this time. It just beat slow and steady. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was softer than I remembered, almost fragile. She asked how I was, said she'd been thinking about things. I told her I was well, that the garden was growing, that the sea breeze kept me company. She paused, as if waiting for me to say more, but I didn't. Some silences have to stay where they belong. Before hanging up, she whispered, "Dad, I'm sorry." I didn't respond right away. I just listened to the sound of her breathing through the line, shallow, uneven, real. "I know," I said finally. Then I ended the call, not in anger, but in acceptance. Because sometimes, forgiveness isn't something you say out loud. It's something you decide quietly, for yourself. That night, I sat by the porch again with a cup of chamomile tea, the sky full of stars. The world looked different now, softer around the edges. I thought about how much time I'd wasted trying to hold on to people who had already let go of me. Now, I was learning how to let go too, not in bitterness, but in peace. I started volunteering again, this time at the same community center that managed my wife's scholarship fund. Once a week, I'd help with their meal program for seniors. It felt good to serve, to listen, to remind people that being seen and being heard still mattered. Some of them told me their stories, children who forgot to visit, families who only remembered when the will was mentioned. I understood that pain too well. We'd laugh, share food, and promise to look after one another. It became my new family, the one I chose. Sometimes, late in the evening, I'd walk down to the beach. The sand felt cool beneath my feet, the waves whispering like old friends. I'd think about my wife, about the laughter that used to fill our house, about the daughter we'd loved too much to discipline when she was young. I used to regret that, not being firm enough. But now, I saw it differently. Love isn't measured by the outcome, it's measured by the effort. And I had loved with everything I had. That was enough. I remember one particular night. The wind was gentle, and the moon hung low over the water. I took off my shoes, rolled up my trousers, and walked along the edge where the waves met the shore. The ocean didn't care who I was or what had happened. It just moved, endless, forgiving, eternal. Standing there, I whispered into the wind, "I forgive you." I didn't know if it was for her or for myself, but it felt right. The words dissolved into the air, carried away like everything else time decides to take. In the months that followed, I noticed something remarkable. My body felt lighter, my mind quieter. The anger that used to sit heavy on my chest was gone. I started sleeping through the night again. I cooked better meals. I laughed more. I even started writing letters, not to send, just to release. I wrote to my wife, to my younger self, to my daughter as she once was, the little girl with pigtails who used to fall asleep on my shoulder. I ended each letter with the same line. You were loved. You are loved. You will always be loved. That became my daily ritual. Not revenge, not reflection, but renewal. By summer, the garden had grown full. Tomatoes hung ripe on the vine. Sunflowers stretched tall and bright, and the bees hummed like they were singing to me. Sometimes neighbors would stop by for a chat or a handful of vegetables. I'd send them away with a smile and a story, not about betrayal or anger, but about resilience, about finding beauty in what remains. One day, A young couple from town stopped by. They were newly married, full of plans and promises. They asked if I had any advice. I thought for a moment, then said, "Never forget that love isn't owed. It's maintained. The moment you stop tending to it, it withers." They nodded, thanked me, and walked away hand in hand. Watching them, I felt a strange peace, like the circle of life had gently closed where it began. Sometimes I still dream of my daughter. In my dreams, she's a child again, sitting at the kitchen table, swinging her legs, waiting for her cup of tea. She smiles when I hand it to her. There's no anger there, no distance, just warmth. I wake from those dreams with tears in my eyes, but they don't sting the way they used to. They remind me that love, once real, never fully dies. It just changes form. Now, when I look at my life, I see two stories, one of pain and one of peace, and both belong to me. I used to think the slap defined me, that her cruelty had rewritten everything I was, but now I see it differently. That moment didn't end my story. It clarified it. It reminded me who I am when the world forgets to be kind. So, every morning when the sun rises over the marsh, I whisper the same words to myself. You did not lose. You learned. And that to me is peace, not the absence of pain, but the understanding that pain no longer has power. Looking back now, sitting here on this old porch with the Atlantic breeze brushing against my skin, I sometimes wonder how a life so full of noise could end in so much quiet. The birds still come to the feeder each morning. The sun still rises over the marsh, steady and faithful. The world keeps moving, even when hearts break and mend and break again. That's the thing about life. It doesn't pause for pain. It flows around it, reshapes itself, and eventually teaches you how to breathe again. I've had a lot of time to think about everything that happened, the slap, the silence, the will, and the peace that followed. When I was younger, I thought wisdom came from education, from reading, from understanding how things worked. But I've learned that true wisdom comes from survival, from walking through storms you never saw coming and realizing that you didn't drown. There are moments now when I sit on this porch and think of her, not the woman she became, but the child she once was. I still see that small girl in her red dress, chasing fireflies on warm Georgia nights, her laughter echoing through the yard. Sometimes I close my eyes and I can almost feel her tiny hand in mine again. It's strange how memory can hurt and heal in the same breath. I used to ask myself where I went wrong. Was I too gentle? Too forgiving? Did I mistake love for loyalty? But then I realized love isn't a transaction. You can give everything you have and still not receive it back. And that's not failure. That's human nature. Some people only understand love when it's gone, and by then, it's too late. The older I get, the less I want revenge, and the more I want understanding. That's what peace really means. Not justice, not payback, but clarity. I don't hate my daughter. Hate is heavy, and my heart's been tired long enough. What I feel now is distance. The kind of distance that doesn't ache anymore. It just exists, like the space between stars. Sometimes I wonder if she's happy. I hope she is. I truly do. Because I've come to understand something that took me 70 years to learn. Peace doesn't come from seeing someone else fall. It comes from watching yourself rise without bitterness. My life is simple now. I wake early, make tea, feed the birds, and take slow walks down to the water. The folks in town know me by name. Old Mr. Harris, they call me. They don't know the whole story, and I don't need them to. They just know I smile more than most, that I carry myself like a man who's seen things but isn't burdened by them anymore. Sometimes the local kids come by after school. They sit on my porch and ask questions about the old days. They like hearing stories about how we used to fix things instead of replacing them, how we'd write letters instead of texts, how we'd solve problems face to face. I tell them those stories because they remind me that time keeps offering second chances, not to relive the past, but to guide someone else through theirs. Every now and then, I visit the community center in the city. The scholarship in my wife's name has grown beyond what I ever imagined. The director told me last month that over 30 nursing students have graduated through it now. I keep their letters in a small wooden box. Thank you notes, graduation photos, stories of lives changed. Each one feels like a heartbeat, proof that something good came from something painful. Margaret would have loved that. She always believed kindness had ripple effects. I used to think she was being naive, but now I see she was right. There's a photograph of her I keep beside my bed, taken on our honeymoon in Charleston, 1968. She's standing by the shore, wind in her hair, sunlight in her smile. Every night before I sleep, I look at that picture and whisper, "We did all right, didn't we?" Because we did. Despite everything, despite the heartbreak and the loss, the love we built still found a way to echo through time. The other day, I got a letter, this time from my daughter. I recognized her handwriting instantly. My first instinct was to leave it unopened, to let it sit there as one more ghost I didn't need to face. But something in me said, "Read it." So I did. It was short, not full of excuses or manipulation this time. Just 3 sentences. "Dad, I've been thinking about you. I saw the scholarship fund in Mom's name. You were right. I'm sorry." That was it. No promises, no explanations. Just words. But they were enough. I folded the letter, placed it in my Bible, and said a quiet prayer. Not for reconciliation, but for her peace. I didn't need her to come back. I just needed to know she'd finally stopped running from herself. That night, as I sat outside watching the stars rise above the dark water, I felt something loosen in my chest. A kind of release. Maybe forgiveness isn't a single act. Maybe it's a slow unfolding. Something that takes years, maybe even a lifetime. But when it happens, it feels like breathing for the first time. I thought of all the people who might one day hear my story. Old men sitting alone in their homes, mothers who feel forgotten by their children, folks who've given everything and been left with nothing. I want them to know this. You are not weak for being kind. You are not foolish for loving deeply. But you must remember, your heart deserves protection too. If my story means anything, let it be this. Silence can be powerful. Dignity is louder than shouting. And sometimes the quietest revenge is simply living well when they expected you to crumble. People often ask me if I regret changing the will. The truth is, I don't. It wasn't about money. It was about truth. I didn't want her to inherit guilt or regret. I wanted her to understand the cost of carelessness. That's a lesson no dollar amount could ever teach. In the end, I learned that love isn't meant to enslave. It's meant to enlighten. You can forgive someone without reopening the door. You can remember them without returning to the fire. That's what peace really is. Remembering without reliving. Now, when I look out across the marsh each evening, I see more than water and light. I see the story of my life, the rise, the fall, the healing. I see my daughter as the lesson, not the loss. I see myself not as the victim, but as the man who finally chose himself. And that choice, that quiet, private decision to stop hurting, changed everything. Before I go to sleep each night, I say a few words out loud, even if no one's listening. Margaret, I'm all right. I found my way home. Because home, I've realized, was never the house I built or the family I raised. Home is the peace you carry when the noise fades and the world stops asking you to prove your worth. So, to anyone listening to my story, wherever you are, if you've been forgotten, dismissed, or hurt by the ones you gave everything to, don't let that be your ending. There's a whole world waiting beyond the pain. Find your porch, your sunrise, your small moments of calm. They belong to you. And when you finally sit down with that peace, like I have, you'll see what I see now, that even broken hearts can build something beautiful, if you let them. Final thought. She slapped my hand when I asked for tea. I poured my will away not to punish her, but to free myself. In the end, I didn't lose a daughter. I found my peace. And that's a trade I'd make every time,